I knew something was fundamentally broken when Brenda from Human Resources knocked on my office door and whispered, "Hey Martin, you forgot to initial the new non-disclosure agreement." I never forget anything. That is precisely why the entire back end of Nexus Dynamics ran like a finely tuned machine instead of a catastrophic dumpster fire waiting for a spark. I was 58 years old, and my memory was a steel trap when it came to documentation. Still, I didn't argue. I signed the piece of paper, handed it back to her trembling hand, and went right back to my terminal, translating dense legal jargon into code triggers for the $300 million Aegis Group merger. It was the same merger they kept announcing, like it was the second coming at every single company town hall meeting, yet absolutely no one on the executive floor actually understood the mechanics of it. 12 years. That is exactly how long I had been sitting in this building at Nexus Dynamics. I did not do it loudly, and I certainly did not do it glamorously. I was never part of the ping-pong table crowd. I wasn't one of the combat boot-wearing slackers who wrote manifestos about corporate culture on our internal wiki pages. No, I was the one who made sure the merger protocols passed the Securities and Exchange Commission sniff tests. I was the architect who built the quiet integration lattice between Aegis Group's creaking legacy systems and our own Frankenstein backend that had been heavily duct-taped together through the tenure of 5 different chief technology officers. You know the kind of work I am talking about. The boring stuff. The critical stuff. The stuff they didn't even know they needed until it was severely broken, and I had to crawl into the server room at 2 a.m. on a holiday weekend to stitch it back together with nothing but black coffee and sheer willpower. That morning, the air in the office felt unusually thick. I had 3 monitors running simultaneously, 2 half-drunk cups of coffee sitting completely cold on my desk, and a bright yellow post-it note that simply read, "Ask legal about the void ab initio clause under FAR 42. It was circled in angry red ink. Behind me, the office hummed with the usual startup bravado that Nexus Dynamics was famous for. Project managers were swaggering around like they had personally invented the concept of time itself. Junior developers were passionately arguing about whether their code architecture was emotionally resonant enough, and one intern was blasting the same 30 seconds of a rap song on an endless loop until I was tempted to staple his headphones to his desk. In the middle of that chaotic symphony, I sat there alone in my corner, meticulously reviewing the final compliance frameworks for the Aegis Group acquisition. My name, Martin, sat right there on the federal documentation in bold print. Third-party signatory, neutral witness, clearance liaison. I was the bridge. Absolutely no one else in the entire company possessed that specific federal clearance. No one else even wanted it. The training alone required 6 months of navigating federal red tape, background checks, and a psychological evaluation. It was like getting licensed to whisper directly into the government's ear. They willingly gave me the power, and then they completely forgot that they did it. I didn't mind. Honestly, I like being invisible. There is a profound sense of freedom in anonymity. You get to build things quietly while the loud people drown each other in meaningless corporate buzzwords. I was never aiming for the spotlight. I just wanted my systems clean, my documentation watertight, and my coffee uninterrupted. The only people who truly noticed my existence were the ones who understood exactly how fragile our entire setup was. People like Oliver in Aegis Group's compliance office, or my old boss, before he burned out and moved out west to start an alpaca farm. To everyone else, I was just Martin in the integration department. Quiet, pushing 60, overdressed for a tech startup, overcaffeinated, and chronically underappreciated. Then Julian arrived. But let's not jump too far ahead. That day I logged into the federal clearance system to file my final report. The Aegis Group deal was scheduled to legally close in exactly 72 hours. My sign-off was the absolute last step. Everything was aligned, months of grueling work, back-end protocols, audit triggers, third-party sign-offs, cross-border data compliance. All of it was ready. Except I paused. My finger hovered over the mouse. Something felt terribly wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it yet, not exactly. But intuition born of 12 years in the trenches is rarely wrong. I opened my personal encrypted folder marked contingency and double-checked the specific FAR Part 42 clause I had highlighted months ago, just in case. Because here is the fundamental truth that no one at Nexus Dynamics ever understood. I didn't build systems for them. I built systems in spite of them. I knew that someday, eventually, they would trip over their own monumental arrogance and try to throw someone exactly like me under the bus. And I wasn't going under. Not without a lit fuse and a securely locked door behind me. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I stood up, walked to the door, and paused. Something caught my eye as I glanced down the hallway. On the front desk, right where they kept the lost keys and the half-dead office plants, was a freshly printed photograph of my face. In thick red marker, someone had scrawled a message across the bottom. Do not let him back on the floor. I wasn't an employee anymore. I wasn't Martin, the guy who saved their servers on Christmas. I was just a physical threat taped to a laminated desk. It hit me in the gut like a brutal sucker punch in a dark parking lot. I had personally trained their last 3 CTOs. I had kept their biggest, most lucrative deal alive with sheer duct tape and caffeine. I had missed family funerals, birthdays, and anniversaries to babysit their goddamn server migrations. And now, after all of that loyalty, I was being treated like a massive liability wrapped in a cheap suit. I didn't cry. That would have been giving them a gift they absolutely did not deserve. I took a deep breath, walked back to my desk, and started packing my things into a standard cardboard box. It looked just like the way people do it in bad sitcoms, except this was painfully real. My palms were cold, my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Everyone around me suddenly found their monitors incredibly fascinating. They avoided eye contact like I was patient zero for a contagious failure. My assistant, Toby, caught my eye from across the busy floor. He mouthed the words, "I'm so sorry," his face pale. I gave him a curt nod and a half-smile. I wanted him to know it wasn't his fault. Then I did 2 very specific things. First, I handed Toby my security badge. I made no scene. I gave no grand dramatic speech. I didn't shout, "You will regret this." Just a quiet goodbye and the soft click of a plastic lanyard being dropped onto polished fake wood. Second, I stepped outside, sat in the driver's seat of my Accord, and unlocked my smartphone. I opened my secure vault application, accessed the heavily encrypted key store, and I deleted one single key. It wasn't a standard password. It wasn't an important file. It was a primary key store entry directly tied to my personal federal clearance certificate. The exact certificate used in every single Aegis Group integration handshake. Without that key, the system couldn't verify the required identity for the third-party sign-off. Without that verification, the merger couldn't legally close. Without me, they were currently holding a live grenade, and they didn't even realize the pin had already been pulled. I didn't smile. I didn't cackle like a movie villain. I didn't even breathe deeply. I just put the car in drive and drove away. My hands were perfectly steady, and my eyes were focused entirely on the road forward. Because they honestly thought they were building something incredible for the future. But in reality, they had just burned down the only bridge they couldn't possibly replace. I didn't even bother to take my coat off when I finally got home. I just stood in the doorway, staring blankly at my car keys resting in the palm of my hand, as if they might suddenly dissolve into dust if I blinked the wrong way. The house was quiet. It was entirely too quiet. There were no relentless Slack notification pings echoing from my phone. There were no frantic emails marked urgent. There was no more, "Hey Martin, just a quick question," which was always immediately followed by 3 grueling hours of unpaid, unappreciated labor. There was just the steady, rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint, low hum of the refrigerator. The cardboard box containing the entirety of my office life sat squarely on the dining room table like a deceased pet. It held a ceramic mug that loudly declared, "I void warranties," a half-used, leather-bound notebook completely filled with scribbled, virtual private network tunnels and margin notes, and a dented tin of peppermints I always kept strictly for sugar crashes during late-night system tests. All of it felt profoundly alien to me now. It felt like I had been violently dropped out of orbit and had crash-landed directly into a tragic diorama of my own massive burnout. 12 years of loyalty reduced to a single box of desk trinkets. I walked straight past the kitchen and went directly to the hallway closet. Pushing past the heavy winter coats and reaching behind a broken laser printer that I always swore I would eventually fix, I found what I was looking for. It was an old, heavy-duty fireproof file box. I dragged it out onto the floor. The metal scraping against the hardwood, popped the dual locks with a sharp click, and began flipping through the hanging tabs. The labels were written in my own neat, deliberate handwriting: legal clearance, protocols, red flags. Then my fingers stopped. I pulled out the thick manila folder aggressively marked contingency. I had carefully prepped this exact folder more than 2 years ago. Not because I was inherently paranoid, but because I actually paid attention to the world around me. You simply do not sit in on high-level executive merger calls for 12 solid months, listening to overpaid executives blatantly lie to each other about redundancy planning and synergy, and not start aggressively preparing for the inevitable moment they pretend you are optional. The folder was thick. It was entirely too thick for someone who was supposedly just legacy tech. I flipped past the colorful organizational charts, the platform architecture diagrams, and the dense Securities and Exchange Commission correspondence. Finally, I found exactly what I was looking for: the original Aegis Group protocol checklist. My name, Martin, was clearly printed in bold at the bottom of every single page as the certified third-party liaison and neutral clearance authority. Oops! I leaned my head back against the closet door, let the stack of papers rest heavily on my lap, and exhaled slowly through my nose. This wasn't petty revenge. This wasn't some malicious act of corporate sabotage. This was simply mechanics. It was basic structural physics. If you carelessly fire a cannon at the main keystone of a bridge, the entire arch is going to collapse. It is inevitable. I pushed myself up off the floor and grabbed my old, rugged backup laptop from the bottom of the closet. I carried it to the kitchen table, powered it up, and bypassed the security warnings to open the heavily encrypted hard drive that I hadn't needed to touch in over 6 months. Inside were the raw backup logs, the keeper registries, the complex liaison handshake protocols, and every single piece of foundational code that they would now have to frantically scramble to reconstruct from scratch. They would likely assign the task to some junior guy from IT who still couldn't figure out how to connect to the correct VPN on his 3rd day of work. I meticulously checked the server logs. I needed to be absolutely certain. Yes, I verified that the deletion I had made from my smartphone earlier in the car had successfully propagated to the primary federal handshake server. The entry was time-stamped. It was locked. It was entirely irrevocable. The federal database now recognized the compliance key as void. They had absolutely no idea what they had just unleashed, but that was about to change very, very soon. I walked over to the coffee maker, poured myself a fresh cup, and stood by the window looking out at my quiet suburban street. The sun was beginning to set, casting long dark shadows across the manicured lawns. Tomorrow morning, Aegis Group's automated systems would wake up, attempt the daily compliance handshake, and notice that a vital piece of the puzzle was missing. The compliance gate would slam shut. The warning klaxons would sound across 2 different corporate headquarters. And then, the screaming would begin. I took a slow sip of the hot coffee, letting the bitter taste settle on my tongue. I was ready for it. Let them scream. I had all the time in the world. The phone call took exactly 4 minutes. And I didn't even bother to rehearse it. I didn't pace nervously around the kitchen island. And I didn't scribble down frantic bullet points on a legal pad like I usually did before high-stakes executive meetings. I just sat calmly at my dining room table, the thick contingency folder resting open beside a bowl of oatmeal that I had entirely forgotten to eat hours ago. I picked up my phone and dialed the specific internal extension number I knew completely by heart. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Aegis Group Compliance. This is Oliver. His voice was bright, energetic, and chipper. It was entirely too chipper for a man who was currently standing right on the crumbling edge of a $300 million financial sinkhole. Hi, Oliver, I said. I kept my tone perfectly flat, projecting nothing but calm professionalism. This is Martin. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint rustling of papers being shuffled and the sharp click of a computer mouse. Oh, hey, Martin. I was actually just looking at your final checklist file on my screen. We were fully expecting your last system sign-off to come through sometime this week. Are you calling to confirm that the handshake protocol went through successfully? I leaned back in my wooden chair, letting my eyes trace the warm pooling of morning sunlight across the living room carpet, acting as if absolutely nothing in the world was wrong. Not exactly, Oliver, I replied smoothly. I just wanted to do a quick check on something in the broader process flow. I wanted to see if there were any unexpected updates or shifts on your end before I submit anything further to the federal database. Another pause. This one stretched on much longer than the first. The cheerful energy in the silence evaporated instantly. Wait, Oliver said, his voice dropping half an octave. You haven't submitted the final approval yet? Why? No, I haven't. Okay, but why, Martin? The closing is in 72 hours. The smile had completely dropped off a cliff. I could practically hear his heart rate accelerating through the phone's speaker. Because they officially terminated my employment yesterday morning, I said, my voice deadpan. Silence. It was the kind of absolute profound silence that happens when all the air gets violently sucked right out of the phone line. I'm sorry, what did you just say? Oliver stammered. No worries, Oliver. It happens in corporate restructuring all the time. I just thought you might genuinely want to have that critical piece of information before you guys proceeded any further with the wire transfers. If your legal team requires formal, written notice for your files, I can have my attorney draft something up and send it over before noon. I didn't include a smiley face. I didn't add a signature. Just those precise words. Exactly 3 minutes later, my phone buzzed with his frantic response. Martin, what the hell is Clause 9C? Everyone on the executive floor is absolutely freaking out right now. HR is running around like they are on fire. Did you hear something? I didn't answer him. I locked the screen and set the phone face down on the table. Let them stew in it. It wasn't an act of cruelty on my part. It was simply an education. It is the exact kind of brutal education you only truly receive when you watch the thick ice suddenly split beneath your boots and you realize with absolute horror that the lifeboats have already sailed away without you. I spent the rest of the morning staring calmly out the front window of my house. The neighborhood was quiet. The sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the dew on the grass. I felt strangely weightless. I wasn't giddy, and I wasn't smug. It just felt as though something massive had shifted tectonically deep within the earth, and for the first time in over a decade, I was finally standing exactly where I was always supposed to be. They hadn't just handed me an incredible amount of leverage. They had beautifully gift-wrapped it, tied it with a neat little bow, and FedExed it directly to my front porch. I didn't need to shout to be heard anymore. I didn't need to actively seek revenge against Julian or the HR department. I was simply the inevitable consequence of their own staggering hubris. And now, they were going to learn exactly what it costs to blindly cut your foundation loose and pretend the entire house isn't going to immediately collapse on top of you. By 2 p.m., the storm clouds had fully parked themselves squarely over the Nexus Dynamics headquarters, and absolutely no one in the C-suite had thought to pack an umbrella. At 2:14 p.m., my phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed a number I recognized instantly. It was the direct line of the chief financial officer of Nexus Dynamics. I stared at the screen as it vibrated across the wooden table. Decline. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Same number, same frantic energy vibrating through the digital signal. Decline. The third time, I let it roll entirely to voicemail. When the notification popped up, I tapped it to listen to the audio. The CFO sounded like a man who was actively trying very hard not to sound like a man completely losing his mind. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Martin. Hi, it's Richard. Look, I know this current situation is absolutely not ideal, but we just had a bit of an unexpected technical hiccup with the Aegis signing today. I was just wondering if we could possibly connect briefly on a call, just to quickly clarify some minor details on the compliance chain data. It's nothing major at all, just dotting the I's and crossing the T's for the lawyers. Please call me back as soon as you get this. I played the pathetic message twice, analyzing the tremor in his voice, and then I permanently deleted it. They honestly thought this was just a simple technical hiccup. They still didn't fully grasp the reality of the situation. It wasn't a hiccup. It was a complete and total lung collapse, and the patient was already turning blue. Julian's grand modernization plan was currently burning to the ground. and I held the only fire extinguisher left in the city. By Friday morning, the situation inside the Nexus Dynamics headquarters had escalated from a frantic attempt at quiet damage control into a full-blown, chaotic corporate cardiac arrest. Today was supposed to be the official signing day for the merger. A massive, catered executive suite circus had been meticulously planned for weeks. There were polished Italian leather shoes, expensive power ties, and thick legal briefs lined up on the massive mahogany conference table like dominoes ready to fall. The powerful delegation from Aegis Group was supposed to roll in right at 10 a.m. Sharp, flash some practiced million-dollar smiles for the hired corporate photographers, and press their expensive fountain pens to paper, while everyone in the room pretended the deal wasn't already practically finished in spirit. But 10 a.m. came and went. There was no Aegis Group delegation. There was no chief legal officer smiling for the cameras. There were no signatures. There was just an agonizing, suffocating silence hanging heavy in the room. Julian stood at the front of the executive conference room. He had one hand shoved deep into his tailored pocket, and his other hand was nervously clicking a black Sharpie back and forth as if he desperately hoped it might magically transform into a magic wand and fix the colossal mess he had created. "Well," Julian finally said, attempting to muster a confident smirk that didn't quite reach his panicked eyes. "You all know exactly how these massive legacy firms are. They are incredibly slow. They are heavily reliant on outdated paper trails. We will simply fix this minor credentialing issue internally." He repeated that last part softly, almost like a desperate prayer to a tech god that had long since abandoned him. "We will fix it internally." Except, the primary problem was that the devastating rot was already internal. Because 3 floors down in the engineering department, someone had finally started whispering loudly about Clause 9C and void ab initio. Apparently, my former assistant Toby simply couldn't help himself. Bless his incredibly nervous, gossip-prone heart, he had casually mentioned the terrifying legal clause to a junior compliance analyst who promptly went aggressively spelunking through the company's dusty, deeply unorganized shared server drives. Within 20 minutes, the analyst found a forgotten unsigned copy of the original merger protocol draft that I had uploaded months ago for a routine review. They read the clause, panicked, and instantly sent a highlighted screen capture to a close friend working over in the legal department. By 11:37 a.m., the screenshot was trending on the company's internal Slack channels. By high noon, the panic officially had legs and was sprinting down the hallways. The general counsel of Nexus Dynamics literally stormed out of his glass-walled office, screaming at the top of his lungs for someone, anyone, to immediately find the original signatory logs. The Human Resources Department was in a total state of meltdown, aggressively pointing fingers at each other. The accounting compliance team froze 3 massive pending vendor invoices just out of sheer terror. Legal started aggressively demanding to know exactly who had given the final executive sign-off on Martin's abrupt termination earlier in the week. The lead merger executive desperately tried calling Aegis Group directly and was immediately stonewalled with a polite but incredibly pointed response. "We are currently reviewing significant internal documentation irregularities. Please stand by." The photo had just landed on LinkedIn with a devastating viral caption attached. "How a modern tech company treats the veteran architect who built their entire infrastructure. This tells the rest of us everything we ever need to know about Nexus Dynamics." It absolutely exploded online. Former employees eagerly chimed in with their own horror stories. Major clients quietly took screenshots and forwarded them to their legal teams. Even Aegis Group's chief compliance officer visibly liked the post from his verified account, an action which immediately sent the Nexus Dynamics legal team into a visible chaotic tailspin right there in the boardroom. Someone had actually printed the viral post out and brought the paper copy into the meeting. Absolutely no one wanted to look at it, but no one dared to throw it in the trash either. Meanwhile, I was sitting comfortably at my kitchen table, sipping a hot cup of green tea, and watching the magnificent storm swirl from the absolute safety of my home. The doorbell rang sharply at 3:15 p.m. I glanced over at the security camera monitor mounted on the wall. A sleek, dark gray Lexus was parked awkwardly across the end of my driveway. A nervous-looking man wearing a sharp blazer stepped onto my porch, holding a thick manila envelope and radiating the kind of desperate hope that you can practically smell through the screen door. He rang the bell twice, waited impatiently, shifted his weight, and then rang it again. I didn't move a single muscle. The house was completely dark inside. I just sat there in the quiet, listening to the faint, soothing hum of a jazz record playing softly in the background, while I casually flipped through the complex licensing terms for a brand new client inquiry. I had registered a new business entity, Quiet Seal LLC, exactly 24 hours ago. It only took me 11 minutes online. Registered agent, business bank account, corporate tax ID, all pending and processing. Just like that, Martin was no longer a discarded aging employee. I was now a formalized corporate entity. I was an independent vendor. I was a heavily armored firewall with a registered mailing address and an incredibly aggressive licensing clause. The man on my porch knocked loudly on the glass. I continued sipping my tea. I watched him on the camera as he paced back and forth, frantically checking his phone for messages, muttering angrily under his breath. Finally, accepting defeat, he wedged the thick envelope forcefully into the crack of the screen door and jogged back to his luxury car. I let the envelope sit exactly where it was until the evening wind finally blew it off the porch and into the bushes. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. I already knew exactly what it said. It was filled with desperate apologies. It was filled with lucrative financial offers. It was filled with vague, corporate hints at reinstatement and restoring organizational alignment. They still honestly thought this was just about getting a job back. They simply didn't understand that I had already built a brand new world from the discarded pieces they had carelessly thrown away. This wasn't about holding a petty grudge. It wasn't about seeking dramatic revenge. It was just done. I was completely done letting arrogant people talk over me in meetings while I quietly kept their entire infrastructure from collapsing around their ears. I was done desperately translating their monumental mistakes into quick code fixes. I was done playing the reliable Sherpa to a massive corporate summit that I was never actually invited to celebrate, so when they knocked on my door, I didn't flinch. I just drank my tea, watched the evening sky slowly darken, and let the storm rage fiercely outside a door that was never, ever going to open for them again. By early Tuesday morning, the agonizing tone inside the Nexus Dynamics executive suites had rapidly shifted from desperate damage control into full-blown, unmitigated panic. The initial shock had entirely worn off, leaving behind nothing but the stark, terrifying reality of their situation. The $300 million deal with Aegis Group was rapidly bleeding out on the operating table, and the brilliant surgeons who had confidently authorized the fatal incision were now desperately scrambling to find a bandage large enough to hide their colossal incompetence. Late that afternoon, Julian, acting under immense, crushing pressure from the furious board of directors, authorized a final, incredibly desperate maneuver. He officially sent a formal employment offer directly through the Human Resources Department to my attorney's secure inbox. The email hit Simon's screen like a frantic hail, Mary Pass wrapped in corporate tinsel. Simon immediately forwarded the document to my personal email with a single, highly amused question attached. Do you want to completely ghost them? Or do you want me to write back and make them bleed? I opened the attached PDF. It was genuinely hilarious. They were officially offering me exactly double my previous base salary, a massive signing bonus, a significant executive title bump to Senior Vice President of Compliance Architecture, and full, unmitigated authority over the entire integration division. It was everything I could have ever reasonably asked for during my 12 years of loyal service, suddenly being violently shoved into my hands only after I had burned the entire house down. I smiled, picked up my phone, and called Simon. Tell them no, but tell them politely. Simon's resulting reply was a masterpiece of legal brutality. It was short, surgical, and absolutely devastating. Mr. Martin appreciates the generous nature of your newly revised employment offer. However, he respectfully declines, as he no longer holds, nor desires to hold, employee status at Nexus Dynamics. Should your organization urgently wish to re-engage his specific expertise to resolve your current compliance crisis, his independent consulting firm, Quiet Seal LLC, is currently available for the limited licensing of relevant architectural services. Premium market rates will strictly apply. A substantial non-refundable retainer is required up front. Engagement remains entirely subject to his personal availability. There was no unnecessary drama. There were no emotional pleas, just cold, hard facts. There would be no more company security badges. There would be no more toxic office politics. There would be absolutely no more red tape and photos taped to desks. That very same evening, the internal chat channels at Nexus Dynamics exploded once again. The rejection email had somehow magically leaked. Someone deeply embedded in the human resources department, probably someone who was incredibly fed up with Julian's disastrous leadership, had quietly pasted Simon's exact response into a massive staff thread titled Emergency Staffing Update. It rapidly circulated through the company faster than any official corporate memo Julian had ever written. Inside the box, nestled carefully in expensive black silk, was a thick, solid gold fountain pen and a small, handwritten note on heavy cardstock. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, and perfectly steady. Next time, I guarantee they will know exactly who built the bridge. Oliver, Aegis Group. There was no aggressive sales pitch attached. There was no desperate ask for a favor. It was just pure, unadulterated professional recognition. It was the exact kind of quiet, powerful respect that doesn't ever come with cheap corporate confetti, but instead lands on your desk with the heavy, undeniable weight of a judge's gavel. I smiled, walked into my new office, and set the velvet box carefully on my solid oak bookshelf, right precisely between the massive Aegis Group merger compliance binders and the freshly minted Quiet Seal LLC operating agreement. Then, I finally walked over and sat down at my brand new desk. My home office didn't smell like burnt, cheap coffee and recycled, toxic corporate ambition. It smelled faintly of fresh pine needles and absolute, undeniable control. 3 massive ultra-wide monitors lit up brightly in front of me. None of them were connected to the Nexus Dynamics Slack channels. None of them were permanently tied to anyone who could ever dare to casually call my life's work legacy tech rot. Quiet Seal LLC had just officially signed its 3rd major enterprise client that morning. Interestingly enough, one of those new clients was actually Nexus Dynamics. They absolutely hated it, and they fought it tooth and nail, but they eventually realized they desperately needed to. They were currently paying to legally license one of the incredibly complex old integration bridges I had originally architected 5 years ago. It was the very same critical infrastructure they had once arrogantly deemed entirely obsolete. Now, it was absolutely mission critical to their basic survival, and I legally controlled all the master access keys. I charged them exactly 4 times my original hourly consulting rate. There were absolutely no complaints from their legal department because this time they completely understood the true cost of failure. As the warm morning sun spilled brightly through the wooden blinds, I wrapped my hands around a fresh, steaming cup of coffee and watched the light catch the golden edge of the velvet box sitting on the shelf. It was a perfectly quiet morning. There were no pointless mandatory meetings. There were no manufactured fire drills. There was just absolute, crystal clarity. My phone buzzed softly on the desk. It was a new email notification. The subject line read, "Respectfully requesting your licensing terms for Q3. I smiled, took a long, slow sip of the rich coffee, and let the bitter taste sit on my tongue for a moment before finally swallowing. Let the frantic corporate world run itself into the ground. I wasn't running in their exhausting race anymore. I was the one dictating the terms.